Imagine millions of taxpayer dollars being funneled into programs with no clear purpose, no accountability, and no oversight. What if the system we trust to manage public funds is being used to hide political agendas and mismanage resources? Well, that's exactly what Elon Musk and attorney Pam Bondi uncovered in a groundbreaking congressional hearing. This is a story about exposing the truth behind the curtain, revealing how federal money meant for public good was being mishandled at the highest levels of government. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear will make you question the very system we rely on. But before we dive into this story, I want to hear from you. Comment down below. Where in the world are you watching from? Let's light up this comment section. And hey, if you love stories with high drama, power shifts, and the kind of moments that leave people speechless, you're in the right place. Tap that subscribe button right now. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we drop the next chapter in these powerful, untold stories. Elon Musk exposed something on live TV that no one saw coming. Millions in taxpayer money gone, and every trail led back to Letitia James. She thought no one would ask questions. But when Elon showed the truth, the entire room went silent. What happened next changed everything. This moment wasn't just another political hearing. It was the moment they never wanted you to see. Nobody had told you this yet, but Elon Musk discovered something buried deep within New York's spending files that could change the way America sees its tax system. It all started quietly, no press, no cameras, just a stack of documents that ended up on Elon's desk through a friend of a friend inside the New York state government. At first, it seemed like boring financial paperwork, budgets, grant allocations, spreadsheets full of numbers. But Elon doesn't skim over the details. He digs deep. One small column caught his attention. It showed hundreds of millions of federal dollars, money meant to support basic services, being funneled into vague programs with titles like Equity Compliance Task Force and Restorative Outreach Units. There were no descriptions, no receipts, just cash flowing out with little to no explanation. As he kept digging, things started to get even stranger. The same addresses kept popping up. Some programs listed 0 staff, others had no contact information at all. One organization had received over $20 million in a single year and didn't even have a working website. The more he investigated, the more questions formed in his head. Where was the money actually going? Who had signed off on it? But instead of going public right away, Elon reached out to someone who had the experience to help take this further, Pam Bondi. She wasn't new to political battles and didn't hesitate to get involved. Within a day, Pam confirmed what Elon had suspected. These weren't isolated mistakes. They were patterns. Patterns that pointed straight to New York Attorney General Letitia James. Pam asked a simple, yet powerful question. Is federal money being used to push political agendas under the cover of justice and equity? And she didn't just ask it quietly. She took that question straight to Congress. To everyone's surprise, Congress listened. A public hearing was scheduled, witnesses were called, and yes, Elon Musk agreed to testify. That's when the media woke up. Headlines lit up with his name. Some praised him, some mocked him, but no one ignored him. The richest man in the world was about to expose what he believed to be the misuse of federal funds by one of the most powerful state officials in the country, Letitia James. But she said nothing. Not a word to the press, no statements, no defense, just silence. This wasn't just a local issue. It was much bigger. What Elon found wasn't just happening in New York. It affected every state that receives federal funding, and more importantly, it affects how your tax dollars are spent. But the full story, the part that really makes people uncomfortable, isn't public yet. That's what this hearing was for. And what Elon revealed inside that room left even seasoned politicians in shock. But if you think you know where this is headed, think again. The truth behind those files and what Letitia James tried to keep hidden is something you'll want to hear for yourself. The hearing started off like any other. A few standard opening statements, some polite greetings, and a couple of nervous jokes from committee members. The cameras rolled, capturing everything. But at first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That was until Pam Bondi took the microphone. She didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She wasn't there to play political games. She was there to make a statement. Her first sentence hit hard. and immediately shifted the tone of the room. She said, "This isn't about politics. This is about money. Your money, and what's been done with it." At that moment, you could feel the room stiffen. Suddenly, the usual formality of a congressional hearing felt hollow. People knew this wasn't going to be another routine discussion. Pam clicked a remote, and the first slide appeared on the screen, a screenshot of a wire transfer. The transfer came from a federal education grant, but instead of going to schools or educational services, it had been redirected to a consulting group that listed its address as a UPS mailbox in Brooklyn. There were no contact numbers, no staff, no financial disclosures. Just a $3.2 million payment labeled as Equity Curriculum Review. Pam paused and let that sink in. The room was silent, the weight of the revelation settling in. She didn't need to shout or raise her voice to make her point. Every word, spoken calmly, landed with surgical precision. That money, she said, was meant for classrooms, yet it had gone to an organization with no staff, no students, nothing. Just an empty box in Brooklyn, and millions of taxpayer dollars. Pam didn't stop there. She clicked the remote again, and the next slide appeared, a mental health outreach grant that had been redirected to an organization hosting workshops on colonial healing through sound baths. It was, to say the least, an odd and highly niche program. The total cost? $870,000. The number of people reached? Just 74 participants. That's right, $870,000 spent to serve just 74 people on something that could hardly be called a program in the traditional sense. The room went cold. Some representatives tried to object, raising concerns about the relevance of the information being presented. But Pam wasn't deterred. She made it clear that this wasn't about political ideologies. This was about oversight. This was about accountability. And most importantly, it was about the simple question of whether taxpayers were being taken for a ride. Another click, and more slides appeared, each one more shocking than the last. There was a housing assistance program that had awarded nearly $9 million to a nonprofit that had only been in existence for 2 months. 2 months. No track record, no history of operations, just a shiny new organization with no experience that somehow managed to receive millions of dollars in taxpayer funding. Pam then clicked again, and the name that appeared on the screen sent a chill through the room. Letitia James. Every document Pam showed had been authorized by James's office. She had signed off on these grants, in some cases even fast-tracking them. As the slides continued to scroll, the evidence grew overwhelming. Pam paused, letting the significance of what she had revealed sit in the air. She didn't need to say much. The silence was deafening. But she wasn't done yet. She looked around the room, surveying the faces of the committee members, many of whom were visibly shaken. She knew what was coming next, but she wasn't going to let them off the hook just yet. For months, New York taxpayers had no idea where their money was going. It was a mystery. And now, thanks to this hearing, they were starting to find out. But Pam wasn't content with just showing the dysfunction. She was there to find answers. And that's when she revealed the twist. The piece of information that would change the entire course of the hearing. She leaned in slightly and said, "Elon Musk will be here in 1 hour, and he's bringing data that none of us have seen before." At that moment, the atmosphere in the room shifted. This wasn't just another policy debate anymore. This was a full-scale revelation. The stakes had been raised, and the room knew it. Pam had set the stage, and now Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur known for shaking things up, was about to reveal the hard evidence that would pull back the curtain even further. Elon didn't just bring opinions, he was going to bring the data. The cold, hard numbers that could not be ignored. The countdown had begun, and everyone in the room knew it. As the hearing broke for a brief recess, the reporters in the room whispered to each other. Their phones buzzed with incoming alerts. The story was about to go global. Pam Bondi remained calm, seated with her folder and a quiet sense of satisfaction. She knew the next part of this story would blow the lid off the whole situation. But Letitia James, the one who had been at the center of all this, was nowhere to be found. Not even a spokesperson had shown up to represent her. She was absent, silent, and that in itself spoke louder than any defense she could have offered. As the hearing resumed, the empty chair with Letitia James' nameplate in front of it became a symbol of her avoidance. The committee chair made a brief statement, acknowledging that James's office had declined to send a representative. The reason? No comment, no explanation, just a formal notification that she wouldn't be participating. The room felt the weight of that silence. Pam didn't react to the empty chair. She simply looked at it, then turned her attention back to the microphone. She knew the focus wasn't going to be on Letitia James anymore. It was on the programs, the numbers, and the systemic issues that had been revealed. This hearing was no longer about what might have happened. It was about what was right in front of them. And no one could deny the truth any longer. The tension in the room shifted dramatically as Elon Musk finally took his seat at the front of the chamber. Everyone knew this was the moment the story would go from accusations to undeniable proof. With no fanfare, no entourage of lawyers or assistants, Elon walked in alone, sat down and adjusted his microphone. His presence was calm, his demeanor focused. This wasn't about showmanship, it was about data. When he spoke, the words that came out were deliberate, measured, and powerful. "I'm not here to give opinions, I'm here to show numbers." And with that, the entire room held its breath. Elon opened his laptop and connected it to the screen behind him. The first graph that appeared was simple, color-coded, and easy to understand, yet impossible to ignore. It showed a sharp spike in federal funds sent to New York over the past 3 years. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. These were just numbers, after all. Federal funds are allocated to state governments for various programs all the time. But then, the second graph appeared, one that displayed how those funds had been distributed. And that's when things got truly unsettling. Instead of being directed toward public services like education, healthcare, or infrastructure, the largest portion of the funds, more than 31%, had been funneled into something labeled social equity reform. Elon paused and allowed the weight of that phrase to sink in. He didn't need to add much commentary. His silence did the talking. Social equity reform. It was a phrase that sounded good on the surface, but Elon pointed out that no federal agency actually defines what that means. There were no clear metrics, no specific goals, and certainly no oversight. It was a massive sum of money with no accountability. And that, he said, was where the real problem lay. Elon clicked again, and this time the screen displayed a map of New York. Data points began to light up one by one, each one representing a program or nonprofit that had received at least $1 million in funding. The map was covered in dots, and there was something eerily similar about many of them. Some programs had the same mailing address, others shared phone numbers, and a few even had the same board members. It looked less like a network of public investments designed to help people, and more like a shell game. One point in particular stood out among the rest. A group called Access for All had received $12.4 million. When Elon's team checked their physical location, they found nothing. An empty office suite, a locked door, no staff, no operation, just an empty office. He let that sink in. The room was quiet. People were starting to get uncomfortable, and that was exactly what Elon wanted. He didn't need to point fingers or make accusations. The numbers were doing all the talking. Questions from the committee started to come fast. Was this fraud? Was someone personally benefiting from these misdirected funds? Elon didn't accuse anyone directly, but he raised an eyebrow and said, "When multiple programs receiving millions share the same P.O. box, something's wrong." He wasn't yelling, wasn't emotional, but his calm demeanor only made his words hit harder. Next, he showed more data: public records, IRS filings, real estate documents, and contract duplicates. All of this was available to anyone who cared to look. It wasn't classified information. There were no secrets here. It was just data that had never been connected before, until now. And then Elon dropped the bombshell. Over $26 million in taxpayer funds had been redirected to entities that either no longer existed or, in some cases, never operated in the first place. He let the silence fill the room. A few committee members tried to push back. Some raised objections, asking if this was simply a case of sloppy paperwork or overcomplicated bureaucracy. Maybe, they suggested, it was just an oversight that dozens of different organizations had received millions of dollars in funding, despite being tied to the same addresses, the same board members, and the same telephone numbers. Elon smiled slightly. Maybe, he said, but what's more likely? That dozens of different groups all made the same mistake? Or that someone wanted it to look like a mistake? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and unflinching. I'm not here to say who's guilty. I'm here to say the data doesn't lie. At that moment, the room understood. The evidence was right there, in black and white. These weren't just mistakes or mismanagement. This was a pattern, and patterns don't just happen by accident. The hearing took a short break after that. People rushed out to file their headlines. The reporters who had been sitting in the back trying to capture every moment were already preparing to spin the story. But Pam Bondi, seated in the front, remained calm and silent. She knew that the hard part of the fight was only just beginning. The absence of Letitia James was still a glaring presence in the room. Her nameplate sat on the table in front of an empty seat. The committee chair made a brief statement, acknowledging that James's office had declined to send a representative. The reason? No comment. That silence in itself was telling. Pam Bondi didn't react to the empty seat. Instead, she turned her attention back to the microphone. She knew what was coming next. Elon Musk had set the stage, and now the room would be forced to reckon with the reality of how federal funds were being spent and who was allowing it to happen. The break in the hearing was brief, but it was enough to stir up a palpable sense of anticipation. When the session resumed, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The first thing everyone noticed was the vacant chair. Letitia James, who had been invited to attend and respond to the damning evidence presented by Elon Musk and Pam Bondi, was nowhere to be found. Her nameplate was still on the table, but the seat in front of it remained empty. The committee chair made a brief, formal statement acknowledging that Letitia James' office had declined to send a representative. No comment, no defense, just a cold and formal notice that she would not be participating in the hearing. The committee was left to process the fact that one of the most powerful public figures in the state of New York, someone whose office had signed off on millions of dollars in questionable grants, wasn't there to defend her actions or offer any kind of explanation. That silence, the absence of Letitia James, spoke louder than any statement could have. It wasn't just an empty chair. It was a statement in itself, a clear message that she was unwilling to face the music. Pam Bondi didn't react. She simply glanced at the empty seat for a moment before turning her focus back to the microphone. She knew that the absence of Letitia James was only going to strengthen her case. This was no longer just about the failures of specific programs or individuals. This was about accountability. And Letitia James's silence, in the face of growing evidence, made the need for accountability even more pressing. Pam decided to take the hearing in a different direction. She wasn't going to dwell on Letitia James' absence any longer. Instead, she shifted the focus to something even more crucial: the outcomes of the programs that had received such large sums of taxpayer money. It wasn't enough to talk about the mismanagement of funds. Now they had to talk about what these funds had actually accomplished, or as Pam would reveal, failed to accomplish. She clicked the remote again, and a new set of documents appeared on the screen behind her. These documents weren't part of Elon Musk's earlier testimony. They were new data, specifically related to the programs that had been funded by the grants in question. The first slide showed an education program in upstate New York that had received nearly $8 million over 2 years. The program was meant to improve graduation rates for minority students. It sounded like a noble initiative, but when Pam dug into the results, it was clear that this was a failure. Graduation rates hadn't improved at all. In fact, they had actually dropped. Pam didn't shout or raise her voice. She just read the numbers slowly and clearly, allowing them to speak for themselves. The disparity between the promises of the program and the actual outcomes was stark, and it was hard to deny. Over $8 million had been spent on a program that had no measurable impact. The room was still. Some members of the committee exchanged uneasy glances. They could feel the weight of what Pam was revealing. This wasn't just a case of inefficient spending. This was about the failure of a program that had received millions in taxpayer dollars with little to show for it. Pam clicked again, and another slide appeared. This time, it was a public health initiative, one designed to serve underserved communities. The grant had amounted to over $5 million, a significant sum for a program aimed at improving public health. But when Pam looked deeper into the program, the results were shockingly inadequate. There were only 3 events held in the entire 2-year span of the grant. That's right, $5 million spent on just 3 events. No permanent staff, no medical professionals on payroll. The program had no lasting infrastructure, no tangible results. It had only volunteers, social media flyers, and vague community healing circles. There was no follow-up, no evidence that these events had any lasting impact on the communities they were supposed to serve. Again, Pam didn't need to make an emotional appeal. She just laid out the facts. This wasn't about ideology, she said. This wasn't about whether equity mattered. This was about whether the people in charge had done what they promised. And in this case, they hadn't. The results spoke for themselves. Another click, and the next slide came up. It showed a housing program that had awarded nearly $9 million to a nonprofit organization. At first glance, it looked like another well-intentioned initiative, one meant to help provide housing for those in need. But when Pam dug deeper into the data, she discovered something troubling. This nonprofit had only been in existence for 2 months when it received the grant. 2 months. It had no history of operations, no track record, and yet it had managed to secure a grant worth nearly $9 million. How was that possible? How could an organization with no proven track record be entrusted with such a massive amount of taxpayer money? The answers weren't easy to find. But Pam didn't stop. She kept going, presenting one program after another, each with its own set of failures and inadequacies. The picture that was emerging was one of widespread mismanagement, of money being poured into programs that either didn't work or had no chance of succeeding, programs that lacked the infrastructure to succeed, programs that operated with no clear oversight, and programs that, quite frankly, shouldn't have been funded in the first place. And through it all, Letitia James' office had signed off on these grants. She had approved the funding, fast-tracked some of them, and signed the documents that authorized millions in taxpayer dollars to flow into these programs. Pam paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. She wasn't just talking about a few bad decisions or isolated incidents. She was showing a pattern of funding going to programs that were ineffective at best and fraudulent at worst. A pattern that pointed directly back to one person, Letitia James. But Pam wasn't finished. She knew that the committee needed more than just data and failed programs. They needed to understand the bigger picture. What does this mean for taxpayers? She asked the committee, if these programs are failing, if the money is being misused, who is accountable? She continued, if this is poor management, we need to know who's responsible. But if it's intentional, if there's an agenda behind this, we have an even bigger problem. She let that question hang in the air. It wasn't just about bad management or misplaced priorities. It was about something much more dangerous, a system that was rigged to mismanage billions of dollars in taxpayer funds without accountability. Pam's voice was steady, but there was a force behind her words. It's not enough to say you care about justice, she said. You have to prove it, and wasting hundreds of millions of dollars on broken programs while children go without proper schools and families live in shelters, that's not justice. The room grew still. Even the committee members who had been skeptical just moments ago were leaning forward now, fully engaged in what Pam was presenting. The evidence was undeniable. And then, in a moment of unexpected clarity, one of the committee members voiced what everyone else was thinking. If Letitia James had nothing to hide, why isn't she sitting here right now? The room fell silent. No one had an answer. But everyone knew the truth. Letitia James had chosen not to show up. She had chosen silence over transparency. And that, in the end, spoke louder than anything she could have said. The hearing had already turned into a political and financial storm, but the real shockwave was just beginning. As the session resumed, The empty chair that had once been occupied by Letitia James became more than just a symbol of her absence. It became a glaring indicator of the accountability that was missing from the very office responsible for overseeing taxpayer funds. The room was now on edge, everyone sensing that the real revelations were still to come. And Pam Bondi was just getting started. She didn't waste any time. With the weight of the numbers and the evidence she had already presented, Pam knew it was time to show just how far the tentacles of this mismanagement reached. It wasn't enough to reveal failures in education and health programs. Now they had to talk about something even more sensitive: housing. The issue that affects everyone, from the most impoverished families to the most powerful politicians. Housing, after all, is the cornerstone of any stable society, and when federal funds that are meant to provide homes for struggling families are misused, the consequences are personal and far-reaching. Pam clicked the remote once again, and a new set of slides appeared. This time, the focus was on a housing assistance program that had been awarded millions of dollars in federal funding. The numbers seemed large, but nothing about the program itself stood out as particularly troubling. At first glance, it was meant to help provide affordable housing for people who needed it most. But Pam had done her homework. She knew that the devil was in the details, and when she looked at those details, she saw something unsettling. The nonprofit that had received nearly $9 million in housing assistance grants had been around for only 2 months when it was approved for the funding. 2 months. Hardly enough time to establish any track record, any history of success, or any reason for why it should be entrusted with such a large sum of money. The organization was a ghost. There were no programs to speak of, no infrastructure, no real impact. And yet it had managed to secure millions in taxpayer money. Pam didn't stop there. She clicked again, and another slide appeared, this time showing a different housing initiative, one that was similarly funded. But again, the story wasn't about success, it was about failure. The initiative, which was supposed to serve underprivileged communities, ended up sending funds to temporary lodging centers. These weren't permanent housing solutions, they were hotels, temporary places for people to stay. But there was no oversight, no logbooks to track who was staying there, no accountability to the taxpayers who were footing the bill. These lodging centers were funded by the same millions of dollars that were meant to build homes, to provide stable housing. And yet, what was being funded were not homes for families, but short-term accommodations for people with no long-term support or stability. It was a temporary solution to a permanent problem, and it didn't fix anything. But the most troubling part of this entire situation wasn't just the misallocation of funds, it was the utter lack of transparency. Pam revealed that there was no way to know who was benefiting from the funds. The shelters and hotels were under no obligation to keep proper records, and there were no systems in place to ensure that the money was being used appropriately. It wasn't just that the funds were mismanaged, they were practically invisible. There was no real public accountability, and no one could say with certainty where the money was going or who was receiving the benefits. Pam leaned in, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about mismanagement," she said. "This is about accountability. This is about transparency. And what we have here is a system where the public, your constituents, the taxpayers, have no way of knowing how their money is being spent, no way of knowing if it's even going to the people who need it most. And that is unacceptable." But she didn't stop there. The housing issue wasn't the only area where federal funds were being funneled without proper oversight. Pam clicked the remote again, and the next slide revealed a staggering number. The state of New York had quietly increased its spending on temporary housing by over 340% in just 18 months. The increase wasn't announced publicly. It wasn't part of any budget debate. It wasn't passed through the usual channels of state governance. Instead, it had been done through backdoor contracts, signed off by state agencies, including yet again Letitia James' office. This wasn't just bureaucratic inefficiency or misplaced priorities. It was a deliberate choice to hide what was happening from the public eye. And the question that kept coming up was the same: why? Pam didn't shy away from the uncomfortable implications of this. She asked the room, What does it mean when federal housing funds are being used for temporary solutions for short-term stays and not long-term housing? What does it mean when you can't even track where the money is going or who's benefiting from it? The answer was clear, and it was starting to dawn on everyone in the room. There was no accountability. The system was broken, and the people in charge of overseeing it weren't doing their jobs. They were allowing the money to flow without any regard for whether it was actually being used for its intended purposes. And Letitia James, as the head of the New York Attorney General's office, was at the center of it all. Pam Bondi wasn't just making a case for better oversight. She was showing that without transparency, without clear accountability, the entire system was open to abuse. Taxpayers had no way of knowing whether their money was being used to help the people who needed it most, or if it was simply being funneled into projects that served no one at all. And the silence from Letitia James only added to the weight of these revelations. She had been invited to the hearing. She had been given the chance to explain, to defend her actions. But she didn't show up. She didn't send a representative. She didn't even attempt to offer a defense. Instead, her office released a vague statement about continuing their work. But it didn't address the core issues at hand. It didn't answer for the missing funds, the misdirected programs, or the failed initiatives. That silence spoke volumes. Pam leaned forward again, looking directly at the committee members. If these programs are failing, if this money is being misused, who is going to be held responsible? How many more families will suffer while officials turn a blind eye to the truth? Her question hung in the air, unanswered, but the committee members knew there was no more hiding. The facts were too clear, the evidence too overwhelming. Letitia James's silence had left a gaping hole in the room, one that could only be filled by answers, and those answers were nowhere to be found. As the hearing continued, the energy in the room intensified. The committee members were on edge, each grappling with the mounting evidence of misused taxpayer dollars. The focus had now shifted from mere policy failures to something much more urgent: accountability. But just as the committee thought the worst was over, the most significant moment of all arrived. Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, had finally broken her silence. But what came next was far from what anyone had expected. A week had passed since Elon Musk's testimony and Pam Bondi's relentless presentation of damning evidence. The press had exploded with headlines, the public's outrage had swelled, and the political pressure was building to an unbearable crescendo. Calls for investigations were coming from every corner, from local politicians to national news outlets. People were asking one question: why wasn't Letitia James speaking out about the millions in missing funds and the failed programs that had been approved under her watch? Finally, Letitia James decided to face the cameras. But it was clear from the moment she walked into that press conference that her response wasn't going to be a defense. No, this was going to be a deflection, a calculated move to distance herself from the scandal that was quickly enveloping her office. She entered the room flanked by two advisors. The air was thick with anticipation. The journalists present had been waiting for this moment, expecting her to offer a full-throated defense, to explain away the damning revelations, and to present some semblance of a plan for moving forward. But when she spoke, the words were less about answering the tough questions and more about deflecting blame and shifting the narrative. "I've done my job to the best of my ability," she began, her tone measured but cold. "And I will not be intimidated by billionaires or political attacks." The statement was carefully crafted, aiming to paint the situation as a political hit job, one spearheaded by Elon Musk and his allies. It was a classic deflection technique, one that tried to redirect the public's attention away from the core issues at hand: mismanagement, lack of accountability, and the loss of taxpayer funds. But Letitia James didn't stop there. She doubled down on her message, claiming that the congressional hearing had been a dangerous precedent, one that was designed to discourage equity-focused initiatives across the country. She suggested that the entire situation was a political stunt, a calculated attack on programs that were supposedly designed to help underprivileged communities. It was the kind of rhetoric that might have worked in a less charged atmosphere, but by this point, the public wasn't buying it. After all, the data wasn't political. It was factual. It wasn't about attacking equity. It was about ensuring that public money meant to serve the public good, was actually being used for its intended purpose. When a reporter asked her directly if she could account for the $26 million that had been flagged by Elon Musk, money that had been redirected to ghost organizations, non-existent programs, and questionable entities, Letitia James hesitated. She paused for a moment, as if weighing her response carefully. Finally, she said, "We are reviewing all claims internally." That was it. A vague, non-committal statement that did little to address the magnitude of the issue. No clear explanation. No commitment to investigate. Just more deflection and an attempt to distance herself from the real consequences of what had been exposed. For a moment, it seemed as though Letitia James was attempting to wait out the storm, hoping that the noise would die down, that the media would shift their focus, and that people would forget about the damning revelations that had been aired in the congressional hearing. But that didn't happen. Pam Bondi, who had been sitting quietly in the background during this press conference, wasted no time in responding. She had been in the trenches for weeks now, making her case before Congress, presenting irrefutable evidence, and demanding answers. And she wasn't about to let Letitia James's weak deflection go unchallenged. Within hours, she was on national television, making her message clear. "This isn't about discouraging equity," Pam said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about discouraging corruption." Pam made it clear that if Letitia James wanted to defend her record, she was more than welcome to appear before Congress and answer under oath. That statement struck a chord with the public. It was bold, it was direct, and it called out the heart of the issue: transparency, accountability, and the need for public officials to be held to the highest standards. Pam's response didn't just go viral. It sparked a firestorm of commentary across social media, in newsrooms, and on television. People were no longer focused on partisan politics or ideological battles. They were focused on a single critical question: where did the money go? Meanwhile, Elon Musk, ever the reluctant celebrity, stayed largely out of the limelight. He didn't need to add anything to the conversation. His data, his testimony, and his role in bringing the truth to light spoke for itself. But his silence was itself an important statement. Musk had never sought the spotlight in this case. He was simply connecting the dots, revealing the truth, and making sure the American people understood the facts. Despite the attempt by Letitia James and her supporters to dismiss the issue as a political attack, the public wasn't fooled. More and more people were asking questions. News outlets began to follow the story, digging into the details of the programs that had been funded by these questionable grants. One particularly bombshell piece of investigative journalism emerged, revealing that one of the nonprofits mentioned by Pam Bondi had actually dissolved months before it received its most recent funding allocation. The nonprofit had received over $1 million in taxpayer funds just last quarter, even though it was technically defunct. This revelation sent shockwaves through the media. It was clear now that this wasn't just a matter of poor management or oversights, it was systemic. There was a pattern of misdirected funds, ghost organizations, and a lack of accountability at the highest levels of state government. A local New York journalist took things further, visiting several of the addresses listed in the DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion grant filings. Of the 3 addresses he visited, 2 were completely shuttered and 1 didn't even exist. What was once a story about waste and inefficiency had now become a scandal about fraud and deception. The pressure continued to build. Governors in multiple states began to ask questions. They wanted to know how their own federal funding was being managed. They called for audits, reviews, and full transparency. People from across the political spectrum, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, were all demanding the same thing: answers. Letitia James's office continued to release vague statements, but they did little to address the growing chorus of outrage. The silence from her office was deafening. The public was no longer willing to accept excuses or deflections. They wanted the truth, and they wanted it now. Pam Bondi didn't back down. She had started this conversation, and now it was becoming a movement. By the end of the week, the pressure reached a boiling point. Lawmakers were no longer sitting idly by. A group of bipartisan legislators introduced a new proposal, the Federal Funds Transparency Act. The bill would require states to publicly disclose all recipients of federal grants and provide quarterly reports for every program funded by taxpayer money. The timing was no coincidence. The bill was a direct response to the scandals that had unfolded. Elon Musk didn't comment directly on the bill, but he posted a simple emoji on social media, a flashlight. It was a clear message. The truth was being exposed, and the system could no longer operate in the dark. Letitia James had tried to weather the storm. She had tried to deflect, to bury the issue, and to hope it would go away. But the tide was turning. The American people, and the lawmakers who represented them, were no longer willing to ignore the facts. The system was broken, and it was time for change. As the storm surrounding Letitia James' office continued to swell, the political and public pressure reached its peak. The tide was unmistakably turning. What had started as a routine oversight hearing had now evolved into a full-scale reckoning. The entire nation was watching, and Letitia James, despite her silence, could no longer escape the growing scrutiny. The investigative journalism that had followed in the wake of the hearing only served to amplify the public's demands for answers. The stories coming from local journalists and watchdog groups were damning. Journalists had now traced funds from New York to out-of-state accounts. Some of the money had ended up tied to political action committees, while much of it had simply vanished, leaving nothing but a paper trail and a growing list of unanswered questions. The full scale of the issue was becoming impossible to ignore. And then, just when it seemed like the whole world was ready to turn its gaze toward New York, something even more surprising happened. Letitia James, who had steadfastly refused to engage in any meaningful way with the public, finally issued a statement. But it wasn't the one anyone had been expecting. She did what many public officials do when backed into a corner. She released a vague, canned response. Her office issued a statement saying that they were committed to equity and accountability, but it was clear to anyone paying attention that this was simply another attempt to deflect. It didn't address the missing funds. It didn't address the ghost organizations. And most importantly, it didn't take any responsibility for the colossal failure of oversight that had allowed millions of dollars in taxpayer funds to go unaccounted for. The statement from James was exactly what everyone expected from an official who had been caught red-handed. No real accountability, just more political spin. But as expected, Pam Bondi wasn't about to let this go unchecked. Pam's response, which came just hours after Letitia James's statement, was sharp, concise, and delivered with the kind of authority that had defined her throughout this entire investigation. "This isn't about discouraging equity," she said again, reinforcing her message. "This is about discouraging corruption, about making sure that every dollar, every cent that is spent by the government is accountable to the people." She wasn't backing down, and neither was Elon Musk. Elon, who had already provided the key data and had shown the world just how much public money had been misused, remained silent on the specifics of the ongoing battle. He didn't need to add any more words to the conversation. His testimony, his data, and his actions had already made their mark. Instead of fighting for the spotlight, he let the facts speak for themselves. The calls for further investigations, independent audits, and transparency only grew louder. Governors in at least 5 states announced their own reviews of federal grant spending, recognizing the widespread issues exposed in New York. The media, which had initially tried to downplay the controversy, began running investigative pieces about the deep flaws in how federal money was being allocated across the country. No one could deny it any longer. This was a systemic problem. Pam Bondi's role in this was no longer limited to just one hearing. She had become a watchdog, a tireless advocate for oversight, and her voice resonated far beyond the walls of that hearing room. She wasn't just an attorney anymore. She was a leader in a movement for transparency in government spending. The political landscape began to shift. No longer could public officials hide behind vague explanations or misleading statements. The public now demanded more. They wanted their tax dollars to be treated with the respect and accountability they deserved. It was a wake-up call for elected officials across the country. And that's when a new bill, the Federal Funds Transparency Act, was introduced. It was a direct response to the revelations exposed during the hearing and the subsequent investigations. The bill required that all states publicly disclose the recipients of federal grants and provide quarterly reports on how those funds were being used. It was a significant move toward ensuring that the public could finally hold their government accountable for how their money was being spent. The momentum for this bill was palpable. Even Republicans and Democrats, typically divided on so many issues, came together to support the cause. Over 60 members of the House signed on to support the bill. The message was clear. This was not a partisan issue. It was about good governance. It was about restoring the trust of the American people in the institutions meant to serve them. The bill moved forward with increasing bipartisan support. Letitia James, who had tried to ride out the storm with silence and vague statements, now found herself in a corner. Her office was under review, and it wasn't just New York anymore. Investigations were opening up in other states, and more state treasurers and lawmakers were taking a closer look at how federal funds were being spent. The accountability wave had reached every corner of the nation, and it was becoming harder for officials to ignore the growing calls for transparency. By the end of the month, several key changes were already starting to take shape. Letitia James' political future had become uncertain. Despite trying to distance herself from the scandal, her failure to respond adequately to the growing crisis had left her in a fragile position. Her office had been rocked by revelations of poor oversight, but the question remained, what had Letitia James tried to hide? For now, she continued in her role, but her reputation had taken a massive hit. The trust that had once been placed in her office had been shattered, and it would take a long time to rebuild it, if it ever could be. As for Pam Bondi, her work was far from over. She had started a national conversation about government accountability, and with each passing day, that conversation grew. No longer was it enough for officials to claim their programs were working without showing any results. The American public now demanded more, and they were no longer willing to accept vague promises without proof. Elon Musk, ever the enigmatic figure, quietly returned to his work. He didn't need to seek further attention. His role in exposing the truth had been decisive. He had used his platform not to chase headlines, but to reveal data that changed the course of this investigation. By connecting the dots, he had given the American people the clarity they needed to see the full picture. And now, with the public awake to the misuse of federal funds, with new legislation in the works, and with the political landscape forever changed, one thing was clear. The days of quietly mismanaging taxpayer money were over. The American people were watching, and they wouldn't let the system slip through the cracks again. As we wrap up this incredible journey of discovery, one thing stands clear. When the American people demand accountability, the system must respond. Letitia James's silence and the millions of dollars misdirected are no longer just footnotes in a political story. They are a wake-up call to every public official that the people will no longer accept corruption or mismanagement in the dark. Pam Bondi's unwavering pursuit of justice, combined with Elon Musk's data-driven revelations, have sparked a movement that is too big to ignore. We are witnessing a shift in how government spending is scrutinized, how transparency is demanded, and how those in power are held accountable. The road ahead is long, but thanks to the voices and actions of those who refuse to let the truth be buried, we are one step closer to a system where the public's trust is restored. Thank you for watching, and remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and continue to ask the tough questions, because the truth will always come to light. See you in the next video.